Welcome back to the insane world of Robert Hendy-Freegard, the puppet master. Last time, we saw him shatter a family in 2012, but now we're jumping back to 1993 to see where this monster was born. It all starts in a British pub with a depressed student named John Atkinson and a bartender spinning a lie so big it hooked him for 10 years, posing as an MI5 spy. This is true crime at its wildest. Hit that like button if you're ready to see how he pulled it off. When Robert knew he had successfully convinced John, he told him, "You need some training. Anyone who works with us, even temporarily, needs to be strong." Robert took John to a basement where there was weight equipment and boxing gear, and began showing him and teaching him how to box and fight. He even started teaching him how to endure punches and hits. According to John, Robert seemed to enjoy hitting him, but Robert made it appear as if it was a test of John's abilities and endurance, and whether he was truly qualified to work with the security service and become a spy. Robert managed to make it seem like you're the one who wants to join us, not us wanting you're the one who needs to endure the training and tests and become stronger to be qualified for our work. It was an incredibly cunning and strange way of manipulation. On top of all this, he convinced him that he needed to disguise himself and change his appearance. He convinced him to dye his hair red and wear different clothes than what he usually wore. It was as if Robert was trying to measure the extent of his control over this boy, and indeed, John was like a puppet in his hands. Whatever Robert told him to do, he did it. Of course, this didn't happen overnight. Robert did it gradually and had John carry out surveillance missions on his dormitory mates. He had him monitor their movements, record their car numbers, see where they went and who they talked to. This continued for several months, to the point where John started missing his classes and lectures to carry out the tasks Robert assigned him. By the way, Robert also convinced him that MI5 would compensate him financially, and that if he succeeded in carrying out these tasks, he would have a future becoming an agent and spy like him, and would receive a respectable salary. This financial and career motivation was one of the things Robert used to motivate and control him more. The matter didn't stop there. Robert began manipulating John's romantic life as well. John had a female doormate named Sarah Smith. This Sarah was from a wealthy family and put one line under the words, "wealthy family." Robert convinced John to try to make this girl Sarah become his girlfriend. John would never have done something like this before, but Robert had basically rebuilt his entire personality. Indeed, John went to Sarah and flirted with her a bit, invited her to dinner, and they started dating as lovers, all at Robert's persuasion. Now we'll understand why. I want you to take a look at this picture. Here on the right we have John, and this girl on the left is Sarah, who is now his girlfriend, and this young man in the middle is named Jim, and we'll come back to him in a bit. As for this girl, her name is Maria Hendy. You might say, wait, Hendy. This name has come up before. Robert's full name is Robert Hendy-Freegard. Why does Maria have the same family name? The reason is simply because Robert was going to marry her. Before all this story, and before Robert met John in the bar and talked to him about his friend who committed suicide, Robert was dating this girl named Maria. She was his girlfriend. Robert didn't target John randomly. Their first meeting in the bar wasn't a coincidence. Robert had researched Maria's classmates and learned about their personalities before starting this plan. John and Sarah, who were now dating, were his targets from the beginning because both their families were wealthy, and he brought them together as a couple to move to the second part of his plan. Keep in mind that Maria, who was Robert's girlfriend, was also being manipulated. She wasn't in on the plan. Now, for Robert to move to the second part of his plan, he needed to convince John and Sarah that they were in danger and targeted by the Irish army. One of the people Robert had John monitor was their dormitory mate Jim, this young man who was with them in the picture. Robert told John that security service officials suspected their friend Jim was an undercover agent for the Irish army. Of course, what helped support this claim was that Jim was indeed Irish, and John's mind was already practically brainwashed. He immediately believed anything Robert told him. So Robert began planting the idea in John's head that Jim was an undercover agent, and that he and Sarah were now targeted by the Irish army because Jim had reported them. What helped Robert create this lie was that John's car suddenly disappeared. He couldn't find it. It vanished, and his girlfriend Sarah's car had all its glass broken, the rear window, windshield, and side windows. as if it were a threat message. Of course, the perpetrator was Robert, to make John believe the lie more. John became convinced that he and Sarah were in danger and targeted by the Irish army, so he asked Robert, "What do we do now? How do we get out of this mess?" Robert told him, "You and Sarah need to escape and leave the city, and I'll help you, I'll come with you." Robert also convinced John that their classmate Maria was targeted along with them, and that Jim had reported all of them to the Irish army. Of course, as I told you, Maria was Robert's girlfriend, but no one knew this. Robert wanted to take them all in one go, take John, Sarah, and Maria. So John asked him, "How will we convince them to escape with us?" "Should we tell them about you and say that you work for the security service?" Robert answered. "No, we won't tell them. They might not be convinced quickly, and we need to escape now. Time is running out. We don't know when the Irish army might move against us." John asked, "Well, what do we do? How will we convince them to come with us?" Robert told him, "I want you to go tell Sarah and Maria that you have cancer, and that the doctors told you you only have a few months left to live, and that your wish before you die is to go on a trip around the country and visit different cities." John, of course, as we said, was brainwashed by now. He was ready to believe anything Robert told him. So he agreed to the plan and went to Sarah and Maria and told them about it. He said he had cancer, and these were his last months of life, and he wanted to go on a trip with them and enjoy it before death overtook him. Of course, the girls were shocked, especially Sarah, but they immediately sympathized and agreed to his request. The man is dying, of course they wouldn't say no. Indeed, on the same day, John and the girls got ready and packed their things and told their families they were going on a trip that might last for 2 weeks around the country. There was no objection from the families because, well, these young people were adults in their early 20s, so they were free to make their own decisions. So at the beginning of the trip, it was John, Sarah, and Maria together. They left in Sarah's car and began touring around the country, moving between different cities. 10 days after the start of this trip, Robert met with John. Robert was introduced to them as John's friend. Of course, Sarah didn't know Robert, but Maria knew him because he was her boyfriend. However, Robert had previously told her not to reveal their relationship, saying the reason was that there was a dangerous secret he would tell her later. Robert's relationship with Maria and its details weren't entirely clear because Maria never spoke to the media. She didn't tell her story. The ones who spoke were John and Sarah. We know the details more from their perspective than from Maria's perspective, but it seems clear that Maria was deceived along with them. In short, after Robert met them 10 days into their trip, he allowed John to tell them the truth that he wasn't suffering from cancer and wasn't going to die. After that, Robert supposedly revealed his true identity as an MI5 agent, British Security Service, and told them that the real reason for this trip was to escape from the Irish army because their friend Jim, who lived with them in the dormitory, was actually an agent for the Irish army. He told them their lives were in danger and they were targeted, so they had to escape quickly, and this was the reason that made John lie about having cancer. John, as we said, was completely convinced of anything Robert said, and Maria was already Robert's girlfriend and had been manipulated and brainwashed before. The only one who might have doubted the situation was Sarah, but Sarah trusted and loved John, so when she saw him convinced, she was convinced too. One of the tricks Robert used on Sarah was telling her about her bank balance. No one knows exactly how Robert managed to get this information. He must have used some sort of trick, but he actually knew Sarah's exact bank balance. When he told her this information and the exact number, she was shocked. He told her he knew this information because he really worked for the security service. If he didn't work for the security service, it would have been impossible to get such information. Perhaps what helped convince them more was the chaos and bombings that were happening in different parts of England at that time, especially the events that happened at their college. In short, all three, John, Sarah, and Maria, were convinced and believed they were targeted by the Irish army. Now, as viewers, you have many doubts in your minds, and to tell you the truth, the matter was strange to me too as I researched the story. Even I started doubting the story as I heard these events. How could he deceive them this way? Where were these people's minds? But after researching and checking several sources, I confirmed that all these events were indeed real. I'm telling you this because I want to prepare you for the next part of the story, Because the most unbelievable part in its strangeness is yet to come. What's gone before is child's play compared to what you're about to hear. It doesn't make sense, but it happened. I'm still talking to you and I can't comprehend how it happened. So I'll tell you this big thing, and then we'll get into its details. After Robert went with these three on this great escape journey from the Irish Army, John, Sarah, and Maria wouldn't see their families again for 10 years. They would remain throughout these years on this alleged escape journey, and Robert would control them like puppets and do whatever he wanted. He would make them live the longest and biggest lie of their lives. I know the story is unbelievable, okay? I know, but I'll tell you the story, and whoever wants to look up these events and verify for themselves can search. The internet is full of it, and the sources are reliable. I wouldn't have brought you this story if I wasn't sure of it. You'll find 1,000 sources. You'll find documentaries, books, newspaper articles in the biggest British newspaper sites, testimonies and interviews with the victims and their families and people close to them. You'll find case files and court records. You'll find police reports and investigation recordings, a long list of sources that confirm all these events. What happened was that after they went on the trip and Robert convinced them he was a security service agent, they kept moving from city to city and wouldn't stay in one city for more than 2 nights. Besides Robert having an amazing skill in persuasion, luck was also on his side. Imagine that once, after they left a town where they had stayed for 2 nights, a town called Warrington, the next day after they left, there were 2 bombings in that town, carried out by the Irish Army. This increased their conviction that they were indeed targeted and pursued, and that Robert's words were true. But what made things more difficult for them was that Robert told them they had to be completely undercover, which meant no communication with their families, because this would increase the danger to them and their families. So a week passed, then 2 weeks, then 3, and they were on this escape journey with no communication with their families. Naturally, Sarah's father began to worry after his daughter missed her classes and lectures and had been absent for a while without reason. He went and contacted John's parents, and they said the same thing. They had no idea where their son was and that he hadn't contacted them during the past period. Sarah's father was feeling anxious and was about to call the police and report his daughter missing, but suddenly the house phone rang and it was Sarah. Robert had somehow received news about Sarah's father's movements and that he was asking about them everywhere, so to prevent the situation from escalating, he decided to have Sarah call her father and reassure him they were fine. She even told him they would visit their house, all 4 of them. Sarah, John, Maria, and Robert would visit Sarah's house. All this was so Robert wouldn't let the father go to the police. Indeed, the 4 visited Sarah's house, arriving at midnight. Imagine something that was very strange. Sarah's father didn't understand what was happening. The 4 entered the house and sat with Sarah's father. He knew John and Maria because John was Sarah's boyfriend and Maria was her friend. But this was the first time he saw Robert, and he immediately noticed that this Robert's behavior was suspicious. He was a strangely self-confident person, speaking with complete confidence as if trying to control the place and direct the conversation in his own way. Robert directed the other 3 to use the same initial lie, which was that John had cancer and was living his last months of life. So they decided to go on this trip for this reason and planned to continue it for a few more weeks. Of course, Robert convinced the 3 to tell this lie to Sarah's father by telling them that if they told Sarah's father the truth about the Irish Army pursuing them and wanting to assassinate them, this would worry him more and might make him vulnerable to danger and targeting. Sarah's father wasn't convinced by the talk and wasn't even convinced that John was sick. Usually, a sick person would look tired, but John looked more scared than tired. He wasn't just scared, he was terrified, and even while talking, his whole body was trembling with fear. So Sarah's father felt something was strange, especially with this new person with them named Robert, but in the end, he couldn't prevent them from doing what they wanted. They stayed that night at Sarah's house, and the next morning, Sarah hugged her father goodbye. They got in their car and returned to the road. Sarah didn't know at that moment that she wouldn't see her father again for 10 years. The situation was strange, and this event and meeting that happened in the house is told by the father himself, and Sarah and John confirm the same story. After this meeting, the young people disappeared again without a trace. The father kept waiting for weeks without even a call from his daughter and those with her. They didn't return to college and remained missing. As we said before, Sarah was from a wealthy family. Her father was rich, so he was the one paying her expenses and credit cards. Throughout this trip where they were supposedly touring around the country, Robert wasn't the one paying. Of course, he was using Sarah and John's cards. John, as we mentioned, also came from a family with above average income. They weren't as wealthy as Sarah's family, but they were well off. They had farms, which was what made John enter an agricultural college in the first place. Throughout the trip, Robert was using their money to spend on himself and the trip, and he would tell them that all this money would be returned to them by the government after this crisis ended and things settled down. He would tell them there was a special funding fund with the security service, and all their expenses during the trip would be covered, and they would be compensated completely. Of course, this was stupid talk that shouldn't have been believed, but they had already fallen into his web. Perhaps this was also one of Robert's most important skills, knowing how to choose his victims. The choice of these three wasn't random. He knew they were from wealthy families and surely studied their personalities, weaknesses, and way of thinking. So, of course, Sarah's father was paying his daughter's expenses and would see these expenses coming from different parts of the country because they were moving from city to city. Robert was like trying to move them quickly, so no one could track him easily. Sarah's father even made a map representing their movements through the bills that came to his daughter's account, and noticed that the amount of movement was frightening. They wouldn't stay in one place more than a night or two, and they could normally move from the north of the country to its south in one day, something crazy. The expenses were crazy: 2 hotels, restaurants, fuel, and even clothes. This increased the strangeness of the situation because Sarah's father knew that his daughter was careful with money. She wasn't wasteful or spending randomly. Here the father began to realize that his daughter might have gotten involved with a con man trying to steal her money. With the extreme worry he was feeling and the long time they had been gone, now more than a month, he decided to inform the police. But the police's response was simply that your daughter is an adult, and according to your words, she left of her own will, and there's nothing indicating she's forced or kidnapped. So we can't intervene. The matter is between you. The father began to feel helpless, but finally, after all these weeks, after more than a month and a half had passed, Sarah called the house again and told her father that the trip would be longer than they had planned and that she would postpone her graduation from college to next year, because that year was supposed to be their final year of studies. Her father tried to reason with her, but Sarah didn't give him a chance. She just told him this and said she wanted to discover herself more and search for her true self, and ended the call without giving him a chance to try to change her mind or convince her of something else. This, of course, was under Robert's direction, and everything she told her father was coached by him. These young people remained hidden from their families for 6 months, and the families were confused, not knowing what to do. The only one among them who was trying to actually move was Sarah's father, who kept trying to convince the police to intervene in the matter, but without success. The police always told him that since there was no kidnapping, they couldn't get involved as they had more important matters to attend to. This led Sarah's father to realize he would have to find his daughter himself. The only thing that could help him was the credit card, as the expenses could show him which city and location they were currently in. He began trying to track his daughter, moving from city to city and contacting places they had been: restaurants, hotels, rental rooms, and others. However, their rapid and constant movement made the task difficult. Robert kept moving them from place to place, especially after he received news that Sarah's father was trying to track him. This was because Sarah's father would call the restaurants and hotels where they had stayed, and sometimes the owners would inform Robert that someone had called asking about them. Robert increased their movement under the pretense that the IRA was tracking them, when in reality, it was Sarah's father who was trying to find them. Finally, Sarah's father managed to locate one of the houses they had rented. They had just rented this house that same day, and Sarah's father arrived at night, expecting to find them staying there. This house was located in a city called Peterborough. Sarah's father went to the house and even managed to break in through one of the back windows, but when he entered, he found no one. The house was empty, except for one room where he found some belongings that belonged to Sarah. He recognized her things, which meant there was a high probability that Robert had moved them from this house in a hurry, as they hadn't taken all their belongings with them. Robert had likely realized that Sarah's father was getting close to them, so they immediately left the house. This was the closest attempt Sarah's father had made to finding his daughter, and he would continue trying to track them over the coming months, but to no avail. Of course, after all that had happened, he knew that his daughter, John, and likely Maria were being manipulated by a professional con artist. But he couldn't comprehend how Robert had managed to completely manipulate all three of them over these months, controlling them emotionally and psychologically through fear and terror, destroying their connections and relationships with their families and friends, and completely isolating them from the world. He had created a new world specifically for them and made them live in it. Even now, like you, I ask myself exactly how he did it. I try to find a logical explanation, but I can't. I can't comprehend it. All we know is that he gradually isolated them from the world until he had complete control over them and could make them do anything he wanted. They themselves now tell their story and don't understand how they were deceived in this way. They say it was as if they were bewitched or hypnotized. They weren't kidnapped or forced to go with him physically, it was all psychological and mental control. Somehow, he managed to convince them they were targeted by the IRA and kept them in a constant state of terror that enabled him to move them from place to place and control every aspect of their lives as he pleased. He literally reconstructed and rebuilt them from the inside. He didn't let them use their real names, giving them fake ones that they got used to until their real names became foreign to them. John became Jimmy, Sarah became Betty, and he made them get used to these names and call each other by them until they forgot their real names. He even changed their appearances, for example. He made Sarah cut her hair short and dye it blonde. Additionally, he warned them never to talk about their past to anyone, claiming it could lead to the IRA tracking them. It was as if he gave them different identities, not only isolating them from their families and friends, but also from their past, their true personalities, and even their names. What he managed to do to them needs to be studied in psychology. After approximately 6 months from the beginning of this journey and constant moving, Robert separated them from each other, John in one city, Sarah in another, and Maria in yet another. He claimed this separation came from higher orders from security agency superiors who had made this decision because they saw it as safer for them. Regarding Maria, she's the one we know least about since, as I mentioned, she didn't appear in the media and didn't tell her story. But what we do know about her is shocking. During these years, Robert married Maria and had 2 daughters with her. According to the information I found, this marriage was to gain control of her inheritance, as her family also had money. But her father didn't give in to his blackmail, even though he already had 2 daughters with her. He married her so that when her father died, he could take control of her inheritance. This is the information I have about Maria, and honestly, I don't have her complete story details, but there are some details about her that we'll mention later. As for John and Sarah, Robert arranged a job for each of them. He got John a job as a waiter or bartender in a bar, while Sarah got a job in a fast food restaurant. These were all difficult jobs with long hours and low pay. Robert managed to turn their lives into a tedious and exhausting routine. They would work their jobs for 10 hours a day, and the rest of the day they would perform surveillance tasks that Robert assigned them. These surveillance tasks were supposedly necessary because they needed to be cautious and alert to the IRA who might target them at any moment. He would sometimes make them monitor certain buildings, people, or cars, record car numbers, track where people were going, recording meaningless things. It was as if he was just keeping them busy with spy missions. What especially helped him at that time was that the rate of bombings and attacks carried out by the IRA had escalated across Britain: shootings, building bombings, shop explosions, bus bombings. This was one of the main factors that helped Robert maintain his lie to them. John and Sarah lived all those days under constant pressure, tension, and terror. Their mental state was completely exhausted and broken. On the other side, Sarah's father continued trying to track them, but without success. At the same time, he was in contact with John's parents, and it appears that John had told his family about the IRA situation, that they were being targeted by the IRA and were fleeing with a security agency agent, Robert. It seems Robert had allowed John to tell his family about the IRA and the story about spies and the security agency, so he could extort money from them under the pretense that this money would go toward protecting their son. John's family, who appeared to be more emotional, easily gave in and continued to transfer money regularly to their son, supposedly for his protection. Of course, Robert took all this money. Imagine that during these years, John's family paid about 400,000 British pounds, which is more than $500,000, and all this money went into Robert's pocket. Now Sarah's father learned from John's family about the IRA story and the lie about them chasing their children. Although he couldn't understand how this deception had worked on the children, at least he now knew what trick had been used on them, and immediately understood that it was all to get their money. This was Robert's only goal. He was trying to get money from each family. The easiest family was John's. Just a call from John would easily get them to send 10 or 20,000 pounds, and this money continued steadily over the years until it reached 400,000 pounds, as we mentioned. But Sarah's family, particularly her father, was harder to deal with. After a while, he stopped paying the credit cards that Sarah was using, so the money stopped. Here, Robert kept pressuring Sarah that she needed to provide money somehow so he could continue protecting her from the IRA. Sarah told him she had an inheritance set aside for her from the family fortune, amounting to 200,000 pounds. But this inheritance was isolated in a special bank account, and she couldn't access it without her father's approval, though technically it was her money. When Robert learned about this, he became greedy for this money and decided to allow her to communicate with her father after more than a year of being cut off from him. Imagine the last time she saw her father was when they visited him at home, and the last time she spoke to him was when she told him she wouldn't continue her studies. This was in early 1993, and now it was 1994. More than a year had passed. Robert hadn't allowed her to communicate with him because he knew he was the one most actively trying to track them down among the parents. He wasn't submissive like John's parents, for example. So he wanted to avoid letting Sarah communicate with him, but now that he knew there was no way to get more money from Sarah except through communicating with her father, he decided to allow it. Sarah called the house phone, and her father answered, not at all expecting to hear his daughter's voice. It was a shock and surprise for him, and immediately as Sarah began to speak, he tried to warn her about Robert, that he was a con man and his only goal was money. 10 years of lies, all sparked by a chat in a pub. Unbelievable, right? Robert's got John, Sarah, and Maria trapped in his web, but the real damage is just beginning. In part 3, we'll dive into how he bled their families dry for millions and pushed his victims to the brink. This story's too crazy to miss. Subscribe, ring that bell, and tell me in the comments. Could you fall for a scam this slick? See you in the next part.